This is brought to you by the George Jackson Grassroots Collective, a progressive organization in the new African independence movement that cultivates revolutionary transfer culture, liberating the minds through awareness and education, protecting and training our people while fostering unity as stated in the Code of Umoja. Welcome to the George Jackson Grassroots Collective Dialogue Session.
This is a dialogue session with the George Jackson Grassroots Collective. Here we have Miss Paula Lehman-Ewing, and we will be asking some questions about her book, Reimagining the Revolution. How you doing today, sister?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. First, I would like to ask, what inspired you to write Reimagining the Revolution? And what message do you hope readers take away from it?
Sure. So I was a career journalist. I like to describe myself as a recovering journalist. But I ended up writing a newspaper for a grassroots organization called All of Us or None. And they are an abolitionist organization that vies for the restoration of human and civil rights for currently and formerly incarcerated people. And through that work, I was introduced to some pretty amazing conversations and pretty amazing people. I wrote a newspaper for that organization, and I wanted to highlight and amplify the voices most directly impacted by the system of mass incarceration. And so I had a bunch of contributors who wrote articles and who did art who were incarcerated, and that's where I first came across the elder Hashima Denham. And I found him to be one of the smartest people I've ever met. And I don't know why it took so long for this to dawn on me, but in the most incarcerated nation in human history, we lock up a lot of brilliance and beauty. And when I started writing the book, which was a exploration of how we can change the way we're moving, because it seemed like traditional protests just weren't cutting it anymore. And so I looked for strategizers, and Hashima was one of the strategizers. I profile 3 others, and I wanted to tell those stories. I think that they're worth telling. I think that the biggest thing that I hope readers will take away from reading the book, is to think outside the box, to think differently, to think beyond the status quo that we've been prescribed. I think once we liberate our minds, we'll be able to liberate our bodies as well.
Your book challenges traditional ideas of revolution. How do you define revolution in today's context? And what does reimagining it look like to you?
Sure. So the organization that I worked for, I joined in February of 2020. So by that summer, the world was on fire. And after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we were planning a demonstration in Sacramento. And I write about this little story in the book where I'm sitting on a bench with my mentor, Ken, who is actually also in the Pelican Bay Shoe for a long time. And we're kind of watching this protest unfold, and, some generic remarks by legislators who come out, and he's just like, this ain't gonna do it. And you kind of look back at the protests over the last 50, 60, 70 years, and they're all about the same thing, and they all look pretty much the same, right? They're like fists raised, signs, maybe some tear gas, some confrontation with police, and all the while, the system of slavery, which is foundational in this country, has just been able to evolve and look different. And so if that is going to evolve and look different, how we fight it has to look different. And so that's kind of what I really love about the autonomous infrastructure mission is it takes into account some of those evolutions. It takes into account COINTELPRO. It takes into account the need to separate from the state because of the structures that are implemented that deny change, that preserve the status quo. And so that's what I sort of sought out, the kind of entrance admission for the book, if you will, are people that are willing to design something completely new. Because I really don't think whatever this is, this system that we are in now is working for anyone.
A key theme of this book is the idea that the current system is irreparable. Can you elaborate on why reform is not enough and why abolition is necessary for true liberation?
Yeah, there are some things about reform that have very objectively allowed systems of oppression to evolve rather than dissolve. So you'll take some of the reforms around, go back all the way to the Civil Rights Act, and just as 2012, they had a march because they started rolling all those back. Reforms are something that, in my opinion, never go far enough. We are kind of dictated by a system of precedent. And a precedent is, how far back are you going to go to preserve a status quo? And in my mind, without completely abolishing the system, oppressive systems will simply evolve. So the prison industrial complex isn't just prison. One of the reforms was electronic monitoring. And electronic monitoring isn't about letting people out of prison. It's about expanding control of the prison system. It's about surveillance, and it's about making sure that people who are incarcerated or were incarcerated are kept under control by prison systems, by parole boards, by law enforcement. And so that's kind of an example of a reform that kind of leaves room for the status quo to maintain and grow stronger. And at the very base level, there's an exemption for slavery in the country's foundational document. So if you're going to have something that is foundational, legally foundational, the only way to overturn the system is to start over, in my opinion.
That's powerful. The concept of revolution can mean different things to different people. How do the activists featured in your book define revolution?
That's a great question. So I'll talk a little bit about the chapters in the book. I think oppression needs to be, there are plenty of systems that need overhauls here in America and around the world, but as I focus here on America, and so I took one organization per system of oppression. And so the chapters explore reimagining communities, capitalism, punishment, and infrastructure. And so the people in the book see revolution, I think, first and foremost, as an end to political solutions for societal problems and putting the solution back in the hands of the people. I think that the people in the book have a commonality between them, that they have kind of taken the power to, like I said, liberate themselves, but also to design their own future. And I found that really powerful. I think that revolution, especially one of the controversial chapters in the book is a chapter on capitalism. And it's Greenwood Bank. It's out of Atlanta. Ambassador Andrew Young, who was a close confidant of MLK, Killer Mike, Mike Render, the rapper, and Ryan Glover are the three co-founders of it. And really, it's based on empowerment through capital. And so it's a problematic chapter because right before it is a chapter on Angela Davis, who says, you know, capitalism will always lead to exploitation. I'm paraphrasing. So I took Mike's idea and I sort of poked and prodded, and I asked him a lot about what he thought about capitalism and the idea of using it. And his understanding of what he's doing is a capitalism that's focused specifically on empowering brown and Black communities. And in my mind, it qualifies for something revolutionary because capitalism has never cared about people. Capitalism has cared about profit. And if you go back to kind of the start of capitalism and Adam Smith, you see that capitalism was supposed to be that there's not a finite pie, that there's something for everyone, that just because someone has some of the pie doesn't mean there's less left. It's that there should be an infinite amount for everyone. That's not something that we see with, you know, tent cities and plenty of housing available, but still people sleeping on the street. And so in my mind, anything that challenged the status quo, that called things as they are, or focused on the people rather than the politics, was revolutionary.
Your book presents key strategies for abolition and liberation. Could you walk us through some of these strategies and explain how these can help sustain social justice movements in the long term?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with Mike, since I was just talking about him. You know, I think that before there was a race divide, it was about power. And I think it's still about power. There's a great book out by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. And it's about really the only thing that's mattered in this country is power and retaining it. And so, you know, Mike's approach to change is empowering people, not corporations, not politicians, but empowering people. In our current state, if you're going to empower people to start making revolutionary change, you're going to need capital. And it's just unfortunate, but I get it. I have a day job. I work as a criminal defense paralegal, just trying to beat the system on all sides. And so I participate in a system that I don't believe in, particularly the criminal justice system, because I'll do anything I can to sort of stem the bleeding. Right before that chapter is a chapter on prison abolition, which is Critical Resistance. Critical Resistance is one of the oldest grassroots organizations. It started out of conferences in Oakland of abolitionist organizers back in the early 2000s. And they've had some really big wins. They've stopped gang injunctions in Oakland, actually in Alameda. They prevented another prison from opening, and they are pursuing a measure to close 10 prisons. And so far, they're almost at half, and they only started a couple of years ago. So, and they do that by changing the narrative. They have a common sense narrative, whether it's highlighting people who are incarcerated, or injustices within the system, or just the fact that Californians are paying for prison beds that are empty. And then, to that end, I profile Ivan Kilgore, who's incarcerated at Solano State Prison. I was actually fortunate enough to see him about a week ago when I was in California promoting the book. I made a stop at CSP Solano. And Ivan it's sort of interesting. He's taken his own personal experiences and turned it into, he's kind of looked at it and said, what could have been different for me to prevent me from being incarcerated? And, one of the things is, he was out on probation. He tried to get a job in construction. Willie Brown, who was the mayor of Oakland at that time, started a 10K plan to have 10,000 new home units in downtown Oakland. And instead of the people who, did blood, sweat, and tears to make that happen, obviously it was gentrified, and people like Ivan were not able to participate. People like Ivan were not able to get a loan for a small business. And so he was back in the underground economy and is incarcerated because of it, as a result. So he's created this sort of idea of reimagining communities where people are empowered to make their communities better, and in doing so, they earn trade skills. They have an investment in that community. They have an investment in keeping it safe, and in preserving it. And in the meantime, they have marketable skills for which to participate in the larger economy. So those are the three besides y'all. And then obviously the chapter on Hashima and the Autonomous Infrastructure Mission focuses on ways to be autonomous outside of the state. One of the things that I spoke about is Grand Rapids, and I talked about community safe zones and this sort of trial and error process and things that are taking root and things that are being kind of still working out. But what I love about it is this very identifiable and reasonable path toward autonomy. I think out of everything, I think what I love about the people in the book is that they don't just have a marching path with a sign. They have a path toward an end that they've envisioned as a better future. And it's very definable, and it's very strategic, and it takes into account obstacles along the way. And so that's one of the things that I think people are really connecting with when they read the book, is that the ideas might seem like, quote, radical at first, but if you start reading it, it actually is quite reasonable.
Yes, ma'am. Beautifully stated. You write about the importance of community building in revolutionary movements. What strategies do you suggest for fostering strong, resilient communities in the face of oppression?
So one thing that I think has been evident in all revolutionary movements, whether it's the Black Panthers, the free speech movement in Berkeley, is that people take care of each other. We keep us safe. We keep us fed. And I think that that's one thing people need to start to do, is to see their neighbors as their neighbors, and that if we're going to end the system, we're going to need as many freedom fighters as possible. I think one way to foster that is this narrative change, is highlighting people that have these brilliant ideas that are close to systems of oppression, because they've been impacted by it, and because they're close to the dragon. They see the chink in the armor, and they can tell you the best way to aim your ammunition. And I think uplifting those voices becomes a real attraction for anyone on any end of the political spectrum, because in the end, the book isn't about politics, and it's not about movements. It's about people. It's about humanity. And we live in an age where we're all living each other's virtual lives on social media because we crave human connection. And I think that's one thing that people don't like about the news, is that it's not about people. And so I think that's one thing that we can do, is start focusing on people, start amplifying voices, start having conversations about where perspectives come from, and what people's ideas are. And then I think finally, I think part of the digital age has us all thinking that we know everything because we have all the answers at our fingertips. But especially in journalism that has this now the 24-hour news cycle and clickbait and a need to provide answers. And I think that is not a way of going about building community. I think that I have tried not to be a prescriber of answers. I've tried to go back to being someone who asks a lot of questions. And so I would encourage everybody to approach any subject or any person or any relationship with curiosity rather than a sense of already knowing kind of the answer. I think that's one of the things that I learned doing this book, is that I can remain teachable. I can definitely have values, but I can remain teachable. And in doing that process, I feel a lot more connected to the people that I speak with.
Many of the activists in your book are engaged in work that challenges deeply entrenched power structures. What do you think are the best obstacles they face in pushing for revolutionary change, and how do they overcome these barriers?
So one of the things that that I mentioned earlier is this idea that more strategic revolutions are taking into account the evolutions of systems of oppression. So, one of the things that I found really interesting about Autonomous Infrastructure Mission was its understanding of COINTELPRO and how that had, weakened or in some cases demolished revolutions of the past. And so this idea of awareness, I think, is really important. And that is something everyone should be aware of. I mean, I live in Denver. We had in Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, they had a government infiltrator in Black Lives Matter movement. So it's still alive. And it shouldn't be a surprise that, as one of the most incarcerated nations, or as the most incarcerated, I'm going to start again. It shouldn't be a surprise that as the most incarcerated nation in history, we're also the most surveilled. And so I think that that's an awareness that that everyone in the book is quite aware of. I think that COINTELPRO, that Autonomous Infrastructure Mission takes it into account in its recruiting. I think that Ivan takes it into account whenever he talks on the phone with me, and there's a recording that says that our phone call is being recorded. And I think they have found ways, people in the book have found ways to work around that. Rather than saying, well, let's target that and get rid of it, and then we can move forward. Instead, there's an acceptance that this is part of the status quo. And I think it's a general acceptance, not just with COINTELPRO, but with the status quo in general, that no matter what happens, the status quo will always fight back. And so I think that the conversation has moved from how can we get on pace to how can we get ahead. And I think that would really change the tables, because so far it seems like the system of oppression has always been one step ahead. We call for decarceration, and then they let people out on electronic monitoring, which I mentioned before. And so it seems like it's always one step ahead. There seems to be an evolution in revolutionary thinking where we don't want to play catch up anymore. We want to get ahead. And so I think that's something that's really interesting.
What challenges do you think activists and revolutionaries face today that are unique to our modern era, and how can they overcome them?
Yeah. So obviously I'm a big proponent of understanding surveillance. I think that having a validation process in who you're engaged with is important. It's one of I think the most important things that I put in the book was autonomous infrastructure missions, dedication to doing that. And I think also there are, with the advent of technology, we are a lot more vulnerable, but there has also been a lot of technology that can improve the way we communicate. So Signal is a great app for communicating because it has disappearing messages, and there are layers to it that prevent interference. I use that a lot as a journalist with sources. I know some other journalists who use it as well, but I would definitely encourage that as a way of communicating. So finding ways that the digital age can benefit you would be great. But also, I think face-to-face is really important. The most engaging conversation I had with Ivan was when I went into prison and sat across the table from him, because there wasn't someone every 15 minutes chiming in that we were being recorded. So, I think personal connection as well. I think that, if you're going to build community, come together in a group, be a community, sit in a room together. I was at a talk recently at University of Berkeley's journalism school, and they were asking, well, what's the best way to authentically portray social movements? And I said, get yourself a chair, just sit in and be there as an observer, not necessarily as a contributor, but as an observer, because the only way to develop community is to be a part of one. And so, having membership meetings, finding ways to come together is going to be essential in doing that. And so that would be the two things I would say is, you have your activists that like post, and then you have activists that march. And I would definitely try to be an activist that plans, that organizes, that strategizes, and then kind of moves in a way that's a bit more strategic, that may take a little longer than posting or making a sign for a street protest. But in the end, I would argue would have a lot more impact.
Beautifully stated, for real. What advice would you what advice would you give to those who are just beginning to engage in revolutionary activism and want to make a meaningful impact?
It's a different question. I got it. So, because I think that, social media has helped and hurt the movement for abolition. I think it's helped in that it's becoming more mainstream. People are more interested in it. People are more aware of it. But I would say that there's a very surface level understanding of what it is based on what you see online. I would also say that it has created, if you get your news on social media, which according to research, like 82% of adult Americans do. And so I would say that if you are starting off in activism, to get offline and into books. I don't think, like, when we talk about elders in the movement, we do that with deference for a reason. That knowledge of up close and personal experiences with oppressive systems is invaluable. So you read George Jackson, you read Hashima's work. Ivan has 4 books out. You read the Huey Newtons and the Frantz Fanons, and you read these revolutionary thinkers, not only because they're great reads, because they're brilliant minds, but because those ideas are there for us to pick up and move forward. I think one of the things that I love about the chapter on Hashima in my book is I think it's such a good example of what prison really is, because both Hashima and my friend Ken, who I mentioned before, were thrown into the Pelican Bay shoe because of different reasons, but 2 of the strikes were because they owned George Jackson, Blood in My Eye. And it's the best example I know of prison not being about controlling crime, but controlling ideas. And so if we're going to reverse that, the best thing that you can do is start enlightening yourself to those ideas. Read the banned books, read the revolutionary thinkers, and get a real understanding. And then once you have a basis in which to have a conversation, ask a bunch of questions. One of the things that my boss over at All of Us or None told me when I first started was, I'm glad you're on fire for this, but this party started long before you got here. So have a really good understanding of what has already transpired, and then ask questions once you get here of people who have already been moving, so that you can move along with them.
Free the land, comrades. My name is Brother Jelani Kwaku Odenga. I am a minister of communication with the George Jackson Grassroots Collective. And the question that I will start off with to you is, throughout Reimagining the Revolution, you showcase the work of both incarcerated and formerly incarcerated activists. Why was it important for you to include these voices, and what unique perspectives do they bring to the movement?
Yeah, I think that incarcerated voices are the most important voices in my book. Because if we are looking at systemic oppression, the people who are most impacted by that, the people who are most oppressed, are modern day slaves, and those are prisoners. I talk a bit in the book, and I'm just kind of looking at the different systems of oppression and explaining them. California is always talking about wildfires, and the prison fire brigade is so important to them that they don't want to decarcerate, because who would fight these fires? Which is what one law enforcement officer said when asked about it. And meanwhile, you have those guys making maybe $1 in active situations to firefighters making well over 90 grand a year. And so I think the most important thing to do, if we're going to say that systems of oppression, which I do, say that systems of oppression stem from a collective history of people who committed genocide to take the land, and then enslaved fellow humans to grow the land and build the land, and then not ever make that land home to the people who lived here or built it up. We're going to have to look at the evolution of slavery. We're going to have to root out slavery and a slaver's mentality. And if I'm going to do that, the most directly impacted person in this country is going to be sitting in a prison cell. So that's one thing that I think is important about highlighting incarcerated voices, is that they are closest to the problem. I talked to Glenn Martin, who's also formerly incarcerated, and he has a saying that the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution and farthest from the resources. And this is my attempt to get them closer to those resources. The other thing that I think is just kind of a personal value is when I worked for the All of Us in a newspaper, I also, thought that I took it very literally that incarcerated voices should be at the front of the movement. And every month, the cover of the newspaper was a full-size image of a piece of artwork done by an incarcerated artist. I made some really important relationships, important to me, with artists who are incarcerated. And I, at the beginning of every chapter of my book, is a print of a drawing made by someone during their incarceration. Two of the artists have since been released. One of them is still in prison. And I think what's so profound about that is that you have someone in the most horrific situation, the darkest place, controlled by a system designed to strip them of humanity, strip them of beauty, strip them of hope, and you have them turn out something that is beautiful. And it's just a great example of never being able to capture someone's mind and having a freedom that can't ever be taken away from you. And so I think that's the really powerful thing about incarcerated artists and incarcerated activists, is that they have these minds that are brilliant and beautiful and resilient and defy the idea of ever being fully under the thumb of anyone else.
Right on. Next question is, can you tell us more about how Elder Hashima Denham's grassroots efforts within the prison system contribute to the larger abolitionist movement?
Yeah, I think, Hashima is very well read and very prolific. And he's just a brilliant mind. I could, when I launched the book, I had him do a recording because I wanted his voice to be present at the book launch. And it was just 15 minutes of brilliance. And I think one of the things that Hashima brings to the table in particular is a really deep-seated understanding of history. And like I said previously, the only way that we're going to be able to overcome a system of oppression that has been evolving for 400 years is to understand it and work around some of the things that are not going to change. And so I think part of what he brings to the table is that he's been able to sort of freeze history and examine it from every angle in order to envision a future. I think the other thing is that Hashima has a very clear idea of where to go. And I think that if you're going to engage in a fight for justice, you need a good idea about where you're going. I think that there's an acceptance among activists that it's going to take a while to get there, but we'll never get anywhere if we don't know where we're walking. And so I think Hashima has a very clear understanding of where we should go. And then because of his very clear vision for the future and his very deep understanding of the past, he's able to lay out this concrete path that makes a lot of sense. And you can already see it working based on my conversations with Bree and Grand Rapids, and you can see a community developing. You can see minds starting to think differently about, where we can find help and where we can lean on each other and who's really helping us and who's really keeping us safe. And so I think that's just an invaluable contribution to any revolutionary movement, is showing how a really clear vision of the future and a really deep understanding of the past can guide us to our next steps.
All right, right on. The next question I want to ask is, Elder Hashima Denham speaks to building a society for Black and Brown people independent of the state. How does his vision differ from or complement other abolitionist strategies in your book?
I think that it complements other strategies in the book in that it's about creating an environment where you have people taking care of people, not politicians taking care of people. I think that it differs in that I don't know if any of the other strategies go as far as to envision basically like a state within a state. That was a very unique aspect of the autonomous infrastructure mission. This idea of a community that operates inside a state. I think the other examples in the book look at changing, the society, like the American society, by implementing various tactics to create power and to shift power and to build community. But I think that to that end, they have a kind of a general idea for that goes across the whole land versus autonomous infrastructure, which plans on doing it community by community. And I think that's a really important distinction because I think that, first of all, each community is different. Each community will have different needs. Each community will have different challenges when it comes to separating from the state. But you put enough of those together and you get the same result. You get a free land. And so I think that's one thing that's different is it's focused on individual communities and building those out versus building a movement amongst all people to move forward. This is a movement for all people that groups people together by community.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation. The next question I have is, you've profiled a variety of activists in reimagining the revolution. How does Elder Hashima Denham's approach to abolition intersects with movements like critical resistance?
Sure. So, obviously there's a very obvious connection to George Jackson. You have Angela Davis is one of the founders of critical resistance, who obviously had close ties to Comrade George. And so one of the intersections is an understanding of past and a feeling of, I think somewhat of a feeling of obligation to carry on ideas of people who the status quo did eliminate so that the status quo could maintain. I think that's one of the things that I learned from the book in my own journey is that I think I started really helpless and hopeless, and I ended with a lot more hope because I know that there are people that the movement didn't end when George Jackson was killed. The movement didn't end when Bobby Seals. So that someone was there to pick up the torch and carry it forward. And so I think that, you could put all of your heart and tears into who's going to be the next president, but that's an 8-year max shelf life. And I look at social movements as something that has been going on for a real long time and will keep moving on and will show up to work the next day after the election and keep working for the people.
In your conversations with Elder Hashima Denham, what insights did you gain about the role of incarcerated individuals in shaping abolitionist thought and action?
Yeah, so one of the things that Hashima and George really talk about is this stance of analyzing concrete conditions. And I think that while we're all out here you know, freaking out about the latest news, or whatever the crisis of the day is. People who are incarcerated are in a great position to read, learn, and analyze. And I think that Hashima has done a brilliant job of that. I think, there's this great quote from Glenn Martin, who I mentioned before in the book, that says, I don't think Black and brown people would like to go to prison to become resilient, but that's what's happened. And so you have this kind of alter education system of people who are incarcerated and who read and who generate ideas and who are able to sort of take a bird's eye view of society, and analyze it in ways that it could be better. What I find remarkable is that these are people who society has shut up and locked away the key, and still they reach back and try to improve that society. I think that takes not only resilience, but a real love of the people.
The activists featured in Reimagining the Revolution are deeply rooted in their communities. What role do local grassroots movements play in creating revolutionary change, and how can individuals support these efforts?
So grassroots movements are always going to be centered around people, around humanity, and around forward movement. I don't think that there's an equivalent to that in politics. I don't think there's an equivalent to that in corporations or even nonprofits. One thing that I love about grass movements is that not only does it have a, unlimited entry for anyone who's willing to help, but it has a persistence that is going to outlast any legislative bill or presidential candidacy or, term limit, of which there are none. But it has been a persistent kind of drumbeat for change and freedom over many, many years. If you're interested in joining a grassroots movement, I would start sitting in on these meetings. I would start having a really clear idea of what you think justice is and align yourself with people who think similarly. I would ask a lot of questions. I would do a lot of research. And I would dedicate myself, have a really good idea of who you are, I think is important. Because for me, I know that I care about humanitarian issues. I care about immigration. I care about women's issues. I care about abolition. But I know the most about the criminal justice system and the systems of oppression that emanate from that. And so that's where I focus my energy, where I know the most and where I have the most likelihood of achieving a narrative that's going to create change. I lend support to other movements, whether it's financial support or amplification. But when it comes to the systems of oppression I know most about, that's where I'm going to focus my energy and my writing. I think one of the things that I learned working at a grassroots organization that was also part of a nonprofit is that a lot of times people try to be everything to everyone, and it ends up muddying a message. It ends up with burnout. So I would say find what you're really passionate about. Join a movement that is focused on that. Lend your support in other ways to other causes, be it the environment, immigration, international politics, whatever you want, but kind of stay focused and don't let that focus waver. And then do what you're best at. Find out what your place is in that movement. I think one of the things that I know a lot of people who really struggle with is, being a white person in a movement for Black liberation. It's not that you don't have a part. You just figure out what the part is. clearly you're not going to be the most impacted member of that system. And so you won't be at the front. But I have found my part is amplifying the voices of people who are. So I know how to tell stories. And I have access to places where those stories will be told. You know, Ivan has written 4 books about himself, and most people are finding out about him through mine. And so if that's going to be my role, is sort of taking people who are farthest from resources and taking them into their stories into the halls of power that have denied them presence and acknowledgement, then that's going to be my place. And I'm very firm in that being my place.
What role do art and culture play in the revolution you're describing in your book? How are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated artists helping to shape the narrative of abolition?
Yeah, so I think prison art, by its very nature, is revolutionary. I think creating something which takes a free mind and a sense of beauty, even in less beautiful things. I think that is already kind of a preservation of liberty within a system that's designed to, I mean, you don't even have a name in prison, you have a number. And these people who create art in prison are doing the most human thing you could do, in defiance of that. So I think it's innately revolutionary to create art. I also think that we live in a day and age of images. I think one of the things that that protests do accomplish is that they've created this array of very moving images. You know, blanketed, tear-gassed crowds or confrontations. I remember that really beautiful image of a woman who is about to be arrested by riot squad, and she's just standing there in a beautiful dress with her head held high. And I think those images translate well to a day and age where most people are on image-based platforms, whether it be TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat. These are all based on imagery. And so I think that that's going to be one of the things that is always going to capture the attention of people is art. And, you know, one of the things I remember about the summer of 2020 is in Oakland, every storefront was boarded up and muraled. And a lot of those murals are still there, and they stop you in your tracks, and they make you think as you go about your day. And I think that we don't do enough of that kind of stopping and thinking, and art really makes us do that.
The revolution you describe in Reimagining the Revolution is a collective one. How do you see different communities across race, class, and geography come together to create a united front for change?
I don't see those divisions, I think, as distinctively or as distinctive as a lot of people do. You know, especially when it comes to race, there's been this sort of flexibility in who is defined by what race based on who needs to be, you know, based on who's in power. Again, that book Cast it has a really good explanation of it. But I think, first of all, you have to have a real sense of humanity. And I think the best way to cross those lines is not to talk about theories and politics, but to talk about people. That's what I have found is connecting most with my readers, is that my book ended up being about people. It ended up being about Hashima. It ended up being about Bree. It ended up being about Ivan and Angela and Mike and Ambassador Young. And it was, you know, it became an exploration of humanity. And I think if you do that, you start exploring your own humanity. You know, and I think once you start caring about baseline humanity, those lines that divide us become a lot more flexible. I mean, I think that might be, I still think, obviously, as I said in the last answer, people have a place in this fight. And it's based on proximity to oppression. But when it comes to coming together and trying to fulfill, these ideals of freedom and justice that we pertain to hold here in America, anyone from the starchest patriot to the most liberal person should all kind of see that as a goal of freedom and justice for all.
Okay, most definitely. Last and final question, and afterwards we will be open up for discussion. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask, after this last question that I'm about to ask, you are more than willing and free to ask. Thank you. The last question, you provide a vision for where we go from here in the fight for justice. In your opinion, what are the first steps we should be taking as a society to move towards the kind of revolution you envision?
So, first I want to be really clear. I am not trying to prescribe. I loved having these conversations because it helped me see the possibilities for the future as endless and complicated and complex, and having different shapes and forms, and therefore having more avenues to achieve them. I think that what you would need to do first is have a really clear vision of where you're going. And that's going to take some analysis of concrete systems, concrete conditions. I think that it's going to take talking to elders. It's going to take seeing the thought processes of the past, and taking all that into account, and then envisioning a future. And then I think it's going to take really concrete steps between here and there. It's steps that take into account the ways the status quo has reared its head to fight back before. It's going to take into account evolutions in technology. It's going to take into account evolutions in systems of oppression themselves. And in the end, just there's no last step until you get to where you're going. And so I think that there's an acknowledgement that there are steps, there's a design of those concrete steps, and there's a willingness to take each step no matter how long it takes.
Thank you. We appreciate you, and we say thank you for all the questions that you have answered, and we appreciate you being a part of this dialogue. I now turn it over to Minister of Intelligence.
I would like to ask, when does the book drop? How can we get it, like to order and purchase? And also, how can you be contacted? Or are there any other links and things that you would like to give us?
Yeah, so the book came out on July 23rd. So it's been out for a little over a month. You can buy it on most places where books are sold, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. If you want, I have a website. This Reimagining the Revolution started as a project. And so there's a lot of media that I did. I recorded these interviews to sort of really try to make the people I talk to people that you can meet and associate with. And so all that is on reimaginingtherevolution.com, which also has links to buy the book, and ways to contact me as well.
What does, you touched on this before, but when you think of George Jackson, what comes to mind? What does he represent to you?
You know, the whole idea of locking up ideas starts with George in my mind. At least in the current context that we're discussing. He represents a powerful challenge, both in his brilliance and dedication and analyses to the status quo, and therefore needed to be confined and eventually eliminated. So, and to me, that still persists today. I mean, my friend Ken was thrown in the shoe because he got a copy of Blood in My Eye. And I mean, it doesn't get more obvious than that the prison system is about confining ideas and controlling ideas rather than controlling people or crime or and so I think that's something that really stood out to me, and in reading George's work is that he had this brilliance and understanding, and I think that of concrete systems, and so I think that his analysis of that, you could sort of, the status quo can kind of take him out of the game, but you have something that is brilliant as that, as brilliant as his way of thinking and his view of fascism in America and his view of systems of oppression, and your ideas like that are not going to die.
Really quickly, on behalf of AIM, we just want to extend our deepest gratitude to you for sharing your time and insights with us. Your book is not just a collection of personal stories, it's a powerful testament to the voices you've uplifted and the profound education you've offered to everybody that's engaged with it. So on behalf of AIM, we just want to extend our greatest gratitude to you.
Thank you for having an amazing story to tell. And thank you for all the work that you're doing with the aim to actually make it a reality. I think that's one of the things that I really hope people realize, is that these aren't just ideas and they're not just theories. There are things that people are putting into practice and actually making happen.